We are following, as we promised, breaking news. It's out of the Eastern District of Virginia, where three sources familiar tell MSNBC former FBI Director James Comey is expected to be indicted in the coming days. The full extent of the charges being prepared against Comey is unclear. Joining us now, MSNBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian and MSNBC Senior Investigative Correspondent Carol Leonnig. Chris O'Leary, Ashley Parker, still with us. Carol, help us understand the reporting.
So, Katie, we have some sources who say that for several weeks now, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia, and actually in offices that are potentially much further south than Alexandria, have been eyeing ways to indict Comey, and they are getting very much closer. The statute of limits, rephrase, they are arguing that Comey, there is evidence to suggest Comey lied to Congress in his testimony on the Hill in September of 2020. And for viewers out in the audience who may not be legally as nerdy as me and Ken, I'll just say that there's a statute of limitations to charge people with the crime of lying to Congress or perjury, and that's 5 years. The 5-year statute runs this month.
So what exactly is he accused of lying about, Ken?
Well, there was an exchange. There was a seminal hearing back in September of 2020 where congressional Republicans grilled him in the Senate about the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, the FBI Trump-Russia investigation. And remember, there were some issues around FBI mistakes, and the Republicans were accusing him of all sorts of misdeeds and of relying on that dossier. But in one exchange with Senator Ted Cruz, he was asked about a previous question that had been put to him back in 2017 by Senator Grassley about whether he had ever authorized the leak of information about the Trump administration or the Clinton administration and Hillary Clinton. And he said that he had not. He repeated his answer back in 2017. The Republicans were suggesting at the time, and we believe at least one theory of this is now, that was a lie. Of course, Comey insists it wasn't a lie. That Comey, in fact, had authorized somehow a leak of information. And what Ted Cruz cited during the hearing was a leak by then Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe to the Wall Street Journal about an FBI investigation into the Clinton Foundation. Now, what's important to know about that is there was a whole Inspector General report about Andrew McCabe's behavior and his leaks, and he was criticized in that report. But that report found that he was authorized on his own as a deputy director to talk to the media, and that he did so without explicit authorization from Comey. So on its face, that doesn't seem to support the idea that Comey lied. Of course, we don't know everything that the grand jury is contemplating. And in fact, I should say, Katie, this is a fluid situation. This could change. We were being told this by three sources that an indictment of Comey is expected in the coming days. They're also saying that this same office is expected to charge Tish James, the New York Attorney General, with mortgage fraud. And of course, Donald Trump, we all saw it posted on Truth Social in recent days, exhorting his Attorney General to charge both of those people as soon as possible. Again, grand juries are secret. This is a fluid situation. It's also important to know, though, that the U.S. attorney, the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in this office, Eric Siebert, was essentially forced out last week, in part because he was refusing to bring these cases. We're told that he was opposed to prosecuting both James and Comey on these grounds, and he's out now. And the new U.S. attorney is a former Donald Trump defense lawyer who's never prosecuted a case. So that's the state of affairs.
What is her legal expertise? Or her legal arena?
She's a lawyer. She was a lawyer in the White House for a while. She represented Donald Trump in the Mar-a-Lago investigation. She's not a prosecutor.
Lindsay Halligan is her name. Carol, do we know that a grand jury is meeting?
I can't say with absolute certainty that they're meeting today, but we know some of the people that have been contacted for information, Katie. We know some of the people who've been asked questions about these theories that Comey allegedly lied to Congress. As Ken described, there is some flimsiness and some factual challenge to some of the theories that we've heard for the ways to charge Comey with a crime, because all of the available documentary evidence, much of which I've read forward and backward, makes clear that Comey did not authorize the leak that Ted Cruz asked him about, and makes clear that actually he was surprised that this information was shared with the news media.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, could they secure an indictment? Yes, the grand jury is a prosecutor's tool. And, I mean,
That was the old saying,
you can indict a ham sandwich,
yeah, there you go.
for sure. The problem is making this charge stick. So is this just political theater, indicting Director Comey, arresting him in his home? But did he actually knowingly provide material false information to Congress? Very hard thing to prove, especially when there's information that has already been established that's exculpatory through an OIG investigation.
What would you say about the desire to go after Comey? I mean, we had a couple months ago when he was on a beach, he posted an image of 8647 in Seychelles, and the administration took that to be a
threat,
death threat against the president.
Which it's not, and it also dovetails into the recent discussions about hate speech and the standard for actual threats is very specific.
They followed him, right? But between a vacation and home, many hours on the road.
Secret Service brought him in. But think about this. The same people from the Secret Service, from the Protective Intelligence Division, who stopped the cyber issue yesterday at the UN General Assembly, were also distracted to go after things like this. Which is not a true threat. The court has established what a true threat is, and Director Comey posting 86 in shells on the beach is not a true threat.
What about the Truth Social post where he says, Pam, you got to go after these people? I'm summarizing. Does that give, in talking to Joyce Vance, she said that might give any sort of any defendant a way out of this by saying this is political retribution. It's something that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to politically target people for prosecution.
It's certainly, the optic of it is terrible. People will perceive this as political retribution, even if it was a legitimate case, which it doesn't appear to be.
But can't a case get thrown out for under that reasoning?
Of course it could. And if he does get indicted and it moves forward, this case could get dismissed at any, step along the way, long before it actually goes to trial.
Yeah, we have to see what the evidence might be presented in an indictment. Let's talk again about what Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, wanting his U.S. attorney and his attorney general to go after perceived political enemies like James Comey, like Adam Schiff, like Letitia James. Ashley, help us understand how much, and I'm sorry to use this again, the teeth behind this. Does he really want these people to be thrown in jail?
Yes, Donald, I will say, let's put it broadly, not speaking exactly to Trump's views on Comey in jail per se, but Donald Trump was furious with Comey going back to the campaign, his first campaign in 2015. He fired Comey during his first term in a way that set off a really chaotic spiral for which he blames Comey. This is someone who has long been on his radar. He has long wanted to punish with whatever mechanisms and teeth possible. I think of that 8647 in Seychelles. As a former waitress, I know 86 to be a food term, right? Like, we're out of this. 86 hamburgers, we're no longer serving hamburgers. And so, again, the idea that the Secret Service would show up for that comment for a former FBI director shows that Donald Trump is, at the very least, very serious about making Comey's life very miserable. At one point, Comey ended up getting targeted by the IRS for one of these sort of tax audits that the odds of any citizen having to undergo are incredibly, incredibly slim. I think it's that post you just showed is not just Donald Trump saying the quiet part out loud, but in his view, it's not the quiet part. It's just what should be done. And he's very clearly instructing the people around him how he wants this handled, how he wants Comey treated.
He has often said that they go after me because they can't go after you, or they go after me to go after you. And he also says that I will be your retribution. So I guess it stands to reason that he believes that going after, or could he believe that going after James Comey and the like, Ashley, is Donald Trump getting retribution for harms not committed on him, but on his voters, on his supporters?
Well, he certainly promised revenge and retribution in this campaign. When voters went to the ballot box, that was very clear that that's part of what they were choosing if they chose Donald Trump, and he promised it on his political enemies like James Comey. I think it's hard to make the case, even for President Trump, that Comey somehow wronged his voters. But I will say that sense of martyring himself, there is still this broader sense that does appeal to Trump's voters of sort of broader grievance, right? That the deep state is after me, they're after you, you're getting a raw deal with institutions and governments, which a lot of his voters do feel. And that if they could do this to me, imagine if I wasn't standing in their way, what they could do to you. And that is an incredibly effective, powerful message for Donald Trump's base.
Late night host Jimmy Kimmel is back, triumphantly returning to his show last night after staring down a government effort to censor and silence him. It's a Trump effort that first looked shockingly effective last week when corporate giant Disney gave in to the Trump FCC chair's blatantly unconstitutional demands that all legal experts who've seriously looked at this say would fail in court if they were tested in court. But they weren't, because Disney first folded. Kimmel then stood strong, the censorship sparking a massive revolt that really did go beyond some of the many skirmishes we have in politics right now. And it led to Disney's then unusual reversal of its own suspension to start this week. And so after so many people, literally millions of people, had weighed in some way on this effort to silence Kimmel, I just want to remind you of something fairly basic, but that's part of the news. We tell you things that you might already have a hunch about. What we saw last night, Kimmel's return, is the first time he has addressed this roiling, ongoing censorship plot, the pressure on him and his team. So this monologue crystallized a free speech win against powerful forces. I'm going to show you some of the key points, because Kimmel mixed grace and appreciation with jokes about some of the absurd facets of what he dubbed a still quite serious struggle that's about a lot more than any single comedy show.
People have been asking me if there are conditions for my return to the air, and there is one. Disney has asked me to read the following statement, and I've agreed to do it. Here we go. To reactivate your Disney Plus and Hulu account, I've been fortunate to work at a company that has allowed me to do the show the way we want to do it for almost 23 years. I've done almost 4,000 shows on ABC, and over that time, the people who run this network have allowed me to evolve and to stretch the boundaries of what was once traditional for a late-night talk show, even when it made them uncomfortable, which I do a lot. Every night, they've defended my right to poke fun at our leaders and to advocate for subjects that I think are important by allowing me to use their platform, and I am very grateful for that. With that said, I was not happy when they pulled me off the air on Wednesday. I did not agree with that decision, and I told them that, and we had many conversations. I shared my point of view. They shared theirs. We talked it through, and at the end, even though they didn't have to, they really didn't have to. This is a giant company. We have short attention spans, and I am a tiny part of the Disney Corporation. They welcomed me back on the air, and I thank them for that.
That's true. And he's probably not spinning there. He understands quite clearly in the larger economic math how that speck on the balance sheet could have been wiped away. But it wasn't, partly because people cared, partly because of you, if you cared. Kimmel summarizing that in a diplomatic way. The reporting and evidence we have suggests Disney was quick to fold to government pressure to oust him, only to fold again days later when the pressure in response proved mighty, and apparently surprisingly large for them. So Kimmel there thanking his employer, the broadcaster, thanking the public and the many people who spoke out against this censorship. And I'm going to show you a little bit more of that point in a second. But again, we're balancing the big, weighty issues and the cultural moment. And so he made this other nod to a bit of TV lore and history when Tonight Show host Jack Paar had first returned to the airwaves after he previously walked off that show in an internal clash over editorial choices.
Anyway, as I was saying before I was interrupted.
As I was saying before I was interrupted.
If you're a real comedy nerd or history buff, you can feel the echoing there. And it speaks to something, that free speech and the ability to do this in whatever method people choose. Some people do comedy, some people do politics, some people are just artists and writers until they find the government comes for them too. This matters across history. Kimmel joking about how the government crackdown was going to grow his audience. Nicole Wallace and I just discussed that with the TV ratings coming in. Last night's show was a ratings bonanza, 6 million live TV viewers. Online clips of this monologue are going viral, passing 15 million views on YouTube in under a day. The count is still rising as we speak and report. It's already now Kimmel's most watched monologue on YouTube ever. Now, that type of interest and response to people saying, don't watch this, or we might take this away, or the government doesn't want you to see this, actually matches a wider communications dynamic you might have heard of. When you try to suppress something, you sometimes draw more attention to it. This is called the Streisand effect. For a time when the star's effort to hide and suppress a single picture of her home ended up backfiring and drawing far more interests. So it is a fact that there's more interest in Kimmel's monologue, but, yes, but, I'm sorry, there's always a but these days. That still will only matter in reality if there is the freedom to find the material and get it. The Streisand effect does not work in North Korea or places with legal, practical tech limits on what you might find on your TV or on their version of what they call the internet, which is censored. Which is a point Kimmel also made last night, referring to autocratic countries and noting that while he is back on air right now, and you just saw the interest online on YouTube, many local affiliates are still today stopping Kimmel's show from being shown under this spat, impacting up to a third of ABC affiliates. There are signs, and some of this is still being reported out, whether that aligns with the MAGA government crackdown. So those are businesses making those decisions, but are they doing it for political and governmental efforts? Kimmel reflecting on that while guarding America's First Amendment freedom.
This show is not important. What is important is that we get to live in a country that allows us to have a show like this. I've had the opportunity to meet and spend time with comedians and talk show hosts from countries like Russia, countries in the Middle East, who tell me they would get thrown in prison for making fun of those in power, and worse than being thrown in prison. They know how lucky we are here. Our freedom to speak is what they admire most about this country. And that's something I'm embarrassed to say I took for granted until they pulled my friend Stephen off the air and tried to coerce the affiliates who run our show in the cities that you live in to take my show off the air. That's not legal. That's not American. That is un-American, and it is so dangerous. Brendan Carr, the chairman of the FCC, telling an American company we can do this the easy way or the hard way, and that these companies can find ways to change conduct and take action on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead, in addition to being a direct violation of the First Amendment, is not a particularly intelligent threat to make in public. Ted Cruz said he sounded like a mafioso. Although, I don't know, if you want to hear a mob boss make a threat like that, you have to hide a microphone in a deli and park outside in a van with a tape recorder all night long. This genius said it on a podcast. But one thing I did learn from Lenny Bruce and George Carlin and Howard Stern is that a government threat to silence a comedian the president doesn't like is anti-American. That's anti-American.
If by anti-American he means anti-American Constitution, fact check true. This is fundamental stuff. The Trump White House lost this round. They're backtracking now from the censorship goals they admitted in public, Kimmel pointing out that even nowadays, when MAGA may get away with a lot, that was too much, and that it was, as he put it, less than a genius move. But compare Trump's recent confessions that he will try to punish critical coverage by yanking broadcast licenses with what they're saying today. Having lost this round, well, they can't admit that they lost or that they had a censorship plot going, even though we all lived through Trump talking about it last week in his FCC chair. So briefly, I want to show you the misleading statement from the White House today, which is still a sign they know they're losing and need to say other stuff. They claim the whole thing was about ratings and not Trump's attacks on free speech.
They give me only bad publicity from the press. I mean, they're getting a license. I would think maybe their license should be taken away.
Take away their license because they're not covering the government the way it likes. That's the stated position of the president. And today, his spokespeople say the opposite, which, again, separate from the credibility, you'd prefer the government and the White House wasn't misleading so much, but that itself is a basically confession and awareness that they're losing this and need to get back off it because it didn't work, at least on this one, for Kimmel. Trump is still threatening ABC, though. Last night, as Kimmel was walking out, he posted an evening statement that he'll test ABC out. Let's see how we do. Last time I went after them, they gave me $16 million. This one sounds even more lucrative. And he means it. Trump proving the very point that so many have warned about, and that apparently Disney chief Bob Iger and others didn't understand. They are very smart, experienced people. They have a lot of strategic advisors around them, but they didn't figure out that surrendering and paying Donald Trump off only invites more attacks. That's true whether you're Disney or Harvard or some of these law firms that have not exactly cloaked themselves in glory or legal planning. Now, some big companies are going through this, their time in the box. I want to show a little more of something else Kimmel said that delves more into our side of the road, news and politics, because he very thoughtfully made a point using this big platform and audience to shout out some of the people who stood up for free speech values, precisely regardless of whether you agree with the said speech.
I want to thank the people who don't support my show and what I believe, but support my right to share those beliefs anyway. People who I never would have imagined, like Ben Shapiro, Clay Travis, Candace Owens, Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, even my old pal Ted Cruz. I don't think I've ever said this before, but Ted Cruz is right. He's absolutely right. The President of the United States made it very clear he wants to see me and the hundreds of people who work here fired from our jobs. Our leader celebrates Americans losing their livelihoods because he can't take a joke. He was somehow able to squeeze Colbert out of CBS. Then he turned his sights on me, and now he's openly rooting for NBC to fire Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers and the hundreds of Americans who work for their shows who don't make millions of dollars. And I hope that if that happens, or if there's even any hint of that happening, you will be 10 times as loud as you were this week. We have to speak out against this.
Powerful. Kimmel with the receipts, using his platform to acknowledge and thank the people who came up and stepped up for him, but also very aware of the way we live now and the career he's had. He knows how things work and how fast you can be hot or not or whatever, and saying, don't just stand up for him, stand up for these free speech values. And he seems to think, based on his experience, that Donald Trump's not done with this, that when he says he'll go after the parent company in other ways for money or a shakedown, that he will. That when he says he'll go after NBC or these other outlets, that he will. And that requires a sustained response. There's an old saying in politics that it's a thin line between the impossible and the inevitable, meaning sometimes something that you don't think could ever happen happens. And when that thing is bad and you say, how is it that in America in 2025 you can have a leader who, whether you agree with his politics or not, it's not really the point, but you could have a leader who openly tries to abuse government power to sacrifice or end the very First Amendment of our Constitution, the basis for all the rest of our civic dialogue and democracy, how can that be inevitable? Well, that's where we are, and the rest is up, as Kimmel said, the rest is up to us. I want to bring in Vanity Fair's Holly Jong-Fast, an MSNBC analyst and author, and Michael Hirschhorn, who's here with his interesting portfolio. He has worked in anti-Trump democracy efforts. He's also a very, I would say, acclaimed, if it's possible, acclaimed reality TV show producer. A lot of people don't think of that field that way. But he created a lot of reality TV and has thought a lot about this culture-politics blend. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, culture is politics. And so I think it's right and important that you take this Kimmel story as seriously as, I don't know, SALT talks might have been taken seriously 40 years ago.
And what did you think Kimmel was achieving last night, what he was expressing?
I think it was an important moment. I think it was something extraordinary. And it was something extraordinary because up to now, we've had this massive failure of elites. And across the board, nobody has stood up. Nobody has had guts until him. And he could have chosen not to do that. So personally, I feel like a little spring in my step. I got emotional watching him. How this plays out, as you said, depends on whether other people get any guts and whether there's a broader shift towards people sacrificing immediate self-interest and short-term gain for a longer-term principle.
Here was Kimmel on that point I mentioned on the ratings last night.
He had no talent, and more importantly than talent, he had no, because a lot of people have no talent to get ratings, but he had no ratings.
Well, I do tonight.
Yeah, look, he did crazy numbers last night, which I think is a sign that this has broken through. I think about when Tom Hanks got COVID. That was a moment a lot of Americans saw that COVID was real. Maybe Jimmy Kimmel being censored by Disney and Nexstar, maybe that's the moment where Americans see that this is real. But what I think is the most interesting about this is resistance, and I'm here to tell you, even though people got sick of the catchphrase, it actually works. What we're seeing is working is what worked in 2016, where people got together and they were like, this is not who we are. And I think it's a real important and valuable lesson, because if people don't resist, like what we saw with all of the different elites, the billionaires and the universities and the lawyers, when they get together and make these deals with Trump, they are captured institutions. They are no longer within the bounds of the law, because all of these deals are not really, they're extra, at best, they're extra legal, right? They're sort of their own nebulous thing. And so those people have no protection. And so Donald Trump knows that, and he keeps going and going and going. And what we see here is that appeasement doesn't work. And honestly, you really see how when Sherry Redstone canceled Colbert, it was actually really every step got us here, has gotten us to more censorship and being less free.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've diagnosed, I mean, we all know a lot of people that are very high up in their various professions. A lot of people have not gotten to the point where they understand that they're not safe unless they do something. And until Kimmel, I was in a kind of constant low state of depression. And there was something about this that felt like, oh, yes, you can stand up for yourself. You can fight back. It is possible. Everything isn't like the clay hasn't hardened yet. We still have some time.
I would just add that Donald Trump's polling the worst he's ever polled. OK, he's underwater on the economy. He's underwater in Texas for the first time ever. Like, this is not a popular president. The fact that people are scared of him because we're all soft and not used to this kind of thing may be true, but it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And you can see this from stores like Target. You know, they were boycotted for going against DEI, and it was real numbers. And that's what we're seeing here. I mean, these are real numbers for Kimmel. And I think it's a really good example that people want normal American democracy.
And Michael, the president and his sort of chief here at the FCC seem to understand that comedy and culture and mainstream discourse outside of political nerds matters a lot to them. It matters to how they're understood in the culture, and they have a schizophrenic or split messaging. Oh, it doesn't matter, and the ratings decline, and well, I mean, if the ratings were low enough, presumably they wouldn't spend so much effort trying to stop Colbert and Kimmel.
Right. I think the reason they felt they had that power is that traditional broadcast television, establishment media, establishment newspapers are in a kind of long-term decline, and they're vulnerable. And what I thought was interesting is the delta between the numbers that Kimmel had on ABC and the numbers that he had on YouTube.
Yeah.
And so there's this big shift happening that is allowing them to kind of hammer away at broadcast because the numbers aren't what they used to be.
Well, the breaking news of the night, reported by MSNBC's Ken Dilanian, who will join our coverage this hour, is that federal prosecutors have written a memo arguing against trying to charge former FBI Director James Comey with crimes. Donald Trump has publicly demanded that James Comey be charged with lying to Congress, which is only possible in the next 6 days before the statute of limitations would run out and make it impossible to charge James Comey on that. This week, Donald Trump forced out the U.S. attorney who he personally installed in the Eastern District of Virginia after that U.S. attorney refused to try to bring charges against James Comey. Donald Trump replaced that U.S. attorney with a woman who has never tried a case of any kind in federal court and has never been a prosecutor, but did serve as one of the lowest-ranking members of Donald Trump's criminal defense team. Donald Trump's attempt to illegitimately use federal power, including federal prosecutorial power, literally knows no bounds in either direction. There's no rule too small for Donald Trump to break and no rule too big for Donald Trump to break. And as you just heard today, Donald Trump had a statue of him and his pal Jeffrey Epstein removed from the National Mall, where the statue had a permit to appear this week until Sunday at 8 p.m. The National Park Service removed the statue this morning, as they said, due to it not being in compliance with the permit. But the National Park Service refuses to say how the statue was not in compliance. It's a 12-foot tall statue, as you just saw, bronze painted statue of Donald Trump and the man who said he was Donald Trump's closest friend for 10 years, the sex trafficker and raper of children, Jeffrey Epstein, who Donald Trump said was a terrific guy. The two men are holding hands in the statue and smiling at each other. That statue made Donald Trump the first president in history to have a statue of himself placed in Washington during his presidency. The National Park Service possibly violating its own permit rules to take down the statue is the least, as we said, of Donald Trump's abuses of presidential power. Last night, in a special election, voters in Arizona gave our first guest tonight one more member of the Democratic team in the House of Representatives. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries will be joined on the House floor by Democrat Adelita Grijalva, who won a special election for the House seat held by her father, Congressman Raul Grijalva, until his death in March of this year. That means one more signature for the discharge petition that can force a vote in the House of Representatives to release the Epstein files. Semaphore reports that Republican Congressman Thomas Massie is, quote, declaring victory on his move to force a vote on releasing the Jeffrey Epstein files after the election to fill a vacant Arizona House seat. And he says House Speaker Mike Johnson and some of the powers that be in D.C. are in full panic right now about it. They came back and tried to get the four of us to take our names off the petition, Massie told Semaphore after an event in his northern Kentucky district. They asked some of my colleagues who are co-signers, and they actually threatened them politically, not physically. Massie said if Johnson uses parliamentary tactics to evade a vote that there's enough notoriety on this issue that people will know that he's sweeping this under the rug. He also said if there is language included in a bill to sideline the petition, those who vote for that bill are part of the cover-up. And the reviews are in for Donald Trump's deranged speech to the United Nations yesterday. Deranged was the word chosen by the British newspaper, the Daily Mirror, which also called Donald Trump the world's most powerful man-baby on the front page. The subheadline says Trump rants to the UN about climate, migrants, Gaza, Sadiq's Sharia London, escalators, marble floors, and teleprompters. The world's most powerful man-baby called for an investigation of why the escalator at the United Nations stopped while Donald Trump was on it. The UN complied and found that the Trump staffer assigned to record video of Donald Trump's escalator ride probably stopped the escalator by mistake as he walked backwards to at the top of the escalator. The United Nations issued a statement about the investigation, saying a subsequent investigation, including a readout of the machine's central processing unit, indicated that the escalator had stopped after a built-in safety mechanism on the comb step was triggered at the top of the escalator. The safety mechanism is designed to prevent people or objects accidentally being caught and stuck in or pulled into the gearing. The videographer may have inadvertently triggered the safety function and the safety function described above. The children at Fox rallied around the world's most powerful man-baby and decided before the UN investigation that the escalator problem and a malfunctioning teleprompter were sabotage.
Yeah, they sabotaged him.
Yeah.
And they could have hurt the First Lady.
Yeah.
Trump would have fallen and he would have gotten back up. But, you know,
they would have blamed it on his rhetoric.
And then they sabotaged the teleprompter.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an insurrection. And what we need to do is either leave the UN or we need to bomb it. It is in New York.
There were no threats from Donald Trump or his administration against the stupidest person at Fox saying we need to bomb the United Nations. Rupert Murdoch, the billionaire owner-operator of the Fox propaganda channel, had absolutely no problem with one of the people he pays to lie for Donald Trump advocating bombing the United Nations. Presumably, their defense is it was a joke. That is not a defense that Donald Trump and his thuggish administration accepted in the case of Jimmy Kimmel, who came back on television last night after Donald Trump tried to get him banned for telling a joke. All Donald Trump succeeded in doing is getting Jimmy Kimmel the largest TV audience possible last night. Rupert Murdoch's refusal in any way to restrict his propagandists who suggest bombing buildings in America is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that there are no standards of any kind for anyone working at the Fox propaganda network, and there never will be. But they will happily continue to try to ban other people from television on other networks. And speaking of deranged, Donald Trump's reason in writing for canceling a meeting with our first guest tonight is that Democrats want, quote, transgender operations for everybody. Those are Donald Trump's actual words in explaining why he canceled a meeting about the federal budget with the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and our first guest tonight, the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries. Donald Trump has also said in writing the Democrats want to leave dead people on Medicaid and Social Security rolls. That's his other reason for not meeting with Hakeem Jeffries. Donald Trump also said the Democrats want crime. Now, no politician in American history has ever accused the other party of being in favor of crime. Many Republicans have claimed that they are tougher on crime. But think of how deranged you have to be to say that Democrats want crime. Does that mean Democrats don't lock their cars? Does that mean Democrats don't lock their homes? Donald Trump says so many deranged things like that in a day that it's impossible to keep up with them. Negotiating the financing of the federal government in bipartisan negotiations is something that every president in our lifetimes has done repeatedly. Prior to Donald Trump, everyone involved in such negotiations has always taken that role very seriously. Everyone involved shared some sense of responsibility to keep the government funded. But how do you negotiate with someone who has no sense of responsibility about anything? How do you negotiate with someone who has already violated the budget laws that you've already passed in Congress? How do you negotiate with someone who's deranged? How do you negotiate with the world's most powerful man baby? Now, we can all sit back and think it's impossible to negotiate with the man baby. And we are probably right. But there are some people who have taken an oath of office that prevents them from fully indulging the feelings that all of us might have tonight about the utter pointlessness of trying to negotiate with the world's most powerful man baby. Our first guest tonight has taken an oath that requires him to do exactly that, requires him to try to do what we all have a right to think might be impossible, requires him to try to negotiate with the world's most powerful man baby.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Former FBI director and outspoken Trump critic James Comey is expected to be indicted by the Department of Justice in the coming days. At this point, it's not even clear what Comey would be charged with. Sources tell MSNBC that one component may be an allegation of lying to Congress almost exactly 5 years ago during testimony about whether he authorized a leak. And that 5-year anniversary is actually quite important here. Comey's congressional testimony at issue was September 30th, 2020, as you see, given there remotely, which means that the 5-year statute of limitations expires next Tuesday, September 30th, 2020. If this Department of Justice, the Trump Department of Justice, wants to charge Comey with this dubious crime, well, it needs to do so before then. Both Comey's lawyer and spokesperson for the U.S. Attorney's Office declined comment to MSNBC, but this looks on its face like a wildly blatant abuse of the justice system, certainly far exceeding anything that we have ever seen since Watergate, at least. It's the culmination of an explicit, in the open effort to use the Department of Justice to persecute and prosecute Trump's political opponents and perceived enemies. Not for crimes they have actually committed, not motivated by some events or facts that come to light, investigations, not because of the facts or the law, but from a desire off-stated by the President of the United States to punish people who criticize him publicly. I mean, just look at the facts as we know them so far. This indictment is expected to come from the Eastern District of Virginia, and of course, that would be the same jurisdiction where prosecutor Eric Siebert was pushed out just last week for refusing to bring bogus charges against New York Democratic Attorney General Letitia James and for raising doubts about the investigation into Comey as well. Siebert was then replaced with one of Trump's former personal lawyers. Lindsay Halligan is a 36-year-old Florida insurance lawyer with absolutely no experience as a prosecutor, has never prosecuted a single case, but who is presumably willing to bring whatever charges the president wants, regardless of the evidence. This appears to be the reason she's being installed. Again, this isn't happening behind closed doors. It's happened right out in the open. Trump said he wanted the Siebert out, right, to the cameras. And then in a directive to Attorney General Pam Bondi that may or may not have been intended to be a private message, but was posted publicly, Trump wrote, quote, "Pam, I have reviewed over 30 statements and posts saying that essentially same old story as last time, all talk, no action, nothing is being done. What about Comey? Adam, Shifty Schiff, Letitia, they're all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done." Adding, quote, "We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now, President DJT." So there you have it, right? The sitting president sort of ticking off an enemies list, directing his attorney general to ensure his political opponents are criminally prosecuted. And our reporting indicates it looks like he is going to get his wish, and swiftly. It hasn't even been a week since Siebert was forced out as line attorneys in that office reportedly were in tears and distraught, as reportedly Bondi and Todd Blanche, the number two, advocated on his behalf because they saw that he was doing his job the way it should be done. But now it appears Trump's new U.S. attorney, just on the job for a few days, has, like a magician pulling a coin from behind a kid's ear, magically found there is new evidence to bring those charges. Evidence that career prosecutors couldn't find. In fact, not just evidence career prosecutors couldn't find, according to a new report from ABC News and confirmed by MSNBC. Quote, earlier this week, prosecutors actually presented Lindsay Halligan with a detailed memo recommending she decline to bring perjury and obstruction charges in Comey. Now, in the context of the looming deadline and the explicit, open, public, and persistent pressure from the president himself, we are reporting the DOJ is considering bringing those very same charges against Comey out of that very same district where he has installed his hand-picked 36-year-old insurance attorney. And the history here is also worth remembering. Comey, a Republican, was appointed to run the FBI by President Obama. He is, of course, quite notoriously the guy who investigated Hillary Clinton's email server, the guy who arguably tipped the 2016 election to Trump when he announced out of nowhere he would reopen that investigation just days before Election Day and then announced, well, actually, there was nothing new. Comey's term as director then continued under the new president, where Trump quickly made it clear he wanted a very close relationship with the historically independent FBI. You might recall this video of Trump embracing a visibly uncomfortable Comey, which then prompted the FBI director to try and blend in with the curtains. Or maybe you remember Comey's retelling of a private meeting he had with Trump, where the new president attempted to use Comey to get the FBI to do his bidding, specifically to drop the criminal investigation into Trump's friend and one-time National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, who ultimately pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI.
On Valentine's Day, I was in the Oval Office for the first counterterrorism briefing of the new president, where I had a prominent role because I was to tell him what the threat is inside the United States. And I had some pretty hair-raising stuff to tell him, and he seemed distracted. And then, I don't think he asked questions, and then at the end, kicked everybody else out, saying he wanted to speak to me alone.
And what did he say?
He said he wanted to talk about Mike Flynn. And then, in substance, in that conversation, he asked me, which I took as a direction, to let it go. That he's a good guy. I hope you'll let it go. And I didn't let it go.
Comey was fired for refusing Trump's entreaties. He learned about it on TV while he was at the event for the Bureau. Comey has, through the years, been now a frequent target of Donald Trump ever since. Earlier this year, do you remember this one? The White House and Fox News attempted to manufacture a controversy where they claimed that an Instagram post by Comey spelling out the numbers 8647 with rocks on the beach was actually a credible threat on the president's life.
He knew exactly what that meant. A child knows what that meant. If you're the FBI director and you don't know what that meant assassination. And it says it loud and clear. Now, he wasn't very competent, but he was competent enough to know what that meant. And he did it for a reason, and he was hit so hard. Because people like me, and they like what's happening with our country. Our country's become respected again, and all this. And he's calling for the assassination of the president.
Obviously, he apologized and said he wasn't calling for violence. But
look, he's a very bad.
What do you want to see happen? What do you want to see happen?
I don't want to take a position on it because that's going to be up to Pam and all of the great people. But I will say this: I think it's a terrible thing. And when you add his history to that, if he had a clean history, he doesn't. He's a dirty cop. He's a dirty cop. And if he had a clean history, I could understand if there was a leniency, but I'm going to let them make that decision.
I'm going to let them make that decision. Those days seem to be over. And it was not long after that, you might remember, that Comey's daughter, Maureen, that was the woman who prosecuted Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, was fired from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, reportedly as a direct act of retaliation from Trump against her father. In fact, Maureen Comey is now suing the Department of Justice, saying that firing was unlawful. And all of this vengeance, petty vindictiveness, is because Comey refused to turn the FBI into the weapon Trump could use to protect his friends and punish his enemies, which he wanted from day one in the first administration and is now using, right? His new Department of Justice and FBI clearly have no such reservations. Ken Dilanian's MSNBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent who will break the story, and he joins me now. Fantastic reporting here, Ken. What is your sense of what this process has been like inside that office, where you do have career folks, you know, I think probably pretty buttoned down, evaluating facts and law, coming to a conclusion? It seems like we don't really have a case here.
You're absolutely right, Chris. And so what Carol Leonnig and I have learned is that, well, first of all, the U.S. attorney who was fired, Eric Siebert, he was skeptical of this case. And it's one of the reasons he was fired, as you laid out. He was Donald Trump's choice to lead this office, the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office. And he was a former D.C. police officer, rose up the ranks as a career prosecutor. So he's a real prosecutor, but he was also a Republican and a MAGA guy. And so he passed the vetting, and they put him in charge of this office. But when it came time to look at this case and the case against the New York Attorney General, he didn't think there was evidence to prosecute. And so essentially Trump forced him out. He was forced to resign. And then Trump gloated and said essentially that he was actually fired. And as you said, Donald Trump has replaced him with his former defense lawyer who's never prosecuted a case. And so she is intending to move forward with this, as we understand it. But there are career prosecutors in the office who don't believe in the case. And we just learned tonight, after ABC reported it, we confirmed it, that they have prepared a memo to Lindsay Halligan, the new U.S. attorney, recommending that she decline prosecution because they said, not only can't we win this case beyond a reasonable doubt, we don't even have probable cause to establish that a crime was committed. That's the lower standard.
Right.
The Justice Department manual requires them to believe that they can win this case beyond a reasonable doubt to even bring it. And so when I heard that, I thought there is some chance now that maybe this doesn't go forward. But our sources are telling us that the plan was to bring this before the grand jury this week. And I think the last day the grand jury meets is tomorrow. And so an indictment could be returned as soon as tomorrow, Chris.
On the grand jury question, I mean, one thing we've seen that has been extraordinary, and I've never seen it in the years that I've covered politics and law, is a series of grand juries refusing to indict in a bunch of cases. This has happened, I think, multiple times in Los Angeles' jurisdiction, where the U.S. attorney there has attempted prosecutions related to those ICE protests. It's happened, I want to say, almost half a dozen times in the District of Columbia, which is just utterly unheard of. Presumably, if Lindsay Halligan's going to get this done, they're going to have to go in and get a grand jury to, indict and run the risk of another no-truth bill?
That's right. And first she's going to have to find career prosecutors who are willing to take this case to the grand jury, criminal practitioners, because she's not one. And then she's going to have to find grand jurors who will agree to indict. And now, of course, we've all heard the saying, a prosecutor can convince a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. And this is a prosecutor's forum. It's a prosecutor's tool. The only evidence they hear is from the prosecutor. But perjury cases are notoriously hard anyway. They have to establish that he knowingly lied, not just that there was a disagreement on the facts or that, Andy McCabe said one thing and James Comey said another thing, which is apparently what happened. But they have to show some kind of evidence that he knowingly lied. And we're not aware of that evidence. And if they don't have it, you're absolutely right. That could be the first bulwark here, is a group of grand jurors who say no thanks. And then if that doesn't happen and the case goes forward, the next bulwark, of course, would be a federal judge with a lifetime appointment who will decide whether this case meets a legal standard.
Yeah,